Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation hosted by Gender Spectrum. Today we're going to talk about beyond male, female, and transgender, and have a discussion about non-binary gender identities. My name is Pam Wool. I'm the Director of Family Services at Gender Spectrum. For those of you who are joining live, I just want you to know you can submit questions using the Q&A feature, and that's at the little boxes at the top right of your screen. If you click it, it'll let you submit a question live, and we will answer them at the end of our discussion. So I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I want to tell you just for those of you who don't know about Gender Spectrum, we are a nonprofit, and our mission is to help create gender-sensitive and inclusive environments for all children and teens. And we do that through education and training, family and youth support, and just being part of the general conversation about gender. So the two people who are going to join our conversation today are Adam Chang and Mare Abrams, and I will let them introduce themselves. Mare, you want to go first? You're muted.
Thank you, Pam. Hi, everyone. I'm Mare. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, and I identify my gender identity as non-binary, but I also use a number of other terms like genderqueer, agender, and we'll go into that a little bit more later. But I just really appreciate everyone being here to join today.
And good morning, everyone. My name's Adam. My pronouns are he or she as long as they're used respectfully. And in terms of my gender identity, I also fall in the non-binary spectrum, but identify as in the middle. And also when speaking about my identity, identify as an older sibling. Thanks for having me here, Pam.
Great, thank you guys. So before we really start talking and doing some questions and answers with Adam and Mare, I want to go over some basic concepts because I know for a lot of families this is a new concept. It can be confusing if their child or a child in their lives tells them that they're non-binary or agender or genderqueer, and we don't even really know what that is. So I'm going to start by talking about the dimensions of gender. When we talk about gender, we talk about there being three dimensions of gender. The first one being biology, so that's kind of your body parts and your chromosomes. The second part is gender expression, and that is really things like what you like to do, how you wear your hair, how you like to dress, activities you like. All of that is just expressing gender. And then the third part of gender identity is really what we call gender identity, and that's how you feel inside. Whether you feel male, whether you feel female, whether you feel both or neither or fluid or non-binary, there's endless amounts of gender identities. It's really personal. There's not just two genders. So Adam, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of definitions of transgender and cisgender for us?
Sure, and within all of that, again, kind of referring to Pam's last point of gender identity, someone could identify as transgender, and that's simply when someone's sex at birth doesn't align or doesn't match up with how a person identifies with their gender identity. And then conversely, maybe cisgender is another identity that has come up more recently and people are becoming more familiar with, and that's when someone's sex assigned at birth does align with how a person identifies their gender. Trans and transgender can sometimes be used as an umbrella term because, again, just simply not having your gender identity align with your sex assigned at birth historically, traditionally has been understood to mean switching from one box to another. So becoming a transgender female or transgender female, or what we say female to male or male to female. Although, again, 2015, evolving understandings of gender and people's understanding that, all right, my gender doesn't align with my sex assigned at birth, that could include other gender identities, right? The things that Pam just listed, genderqueer, agender, gender neutral. And we'll go into kind of how these terms come up in just a little bit. I do want to throw out there that another umbrella term that we like to use at Gender Spectrum is gender expansive. And that includes transgender, but we just find that transgender does have a lot of historical context, and here today, with the term like gender expansive, it can apply more broadly to anyone who's really just expanding understandings of gender through their roles, through their existence, through their identities, however it may be.
Great, thank you, Adam. And Mare, will you talk about kind of what binary and non-binary mean?
Yeah, so I think, a lot of what Adam was talking about is this idea in our society that there are two genders, right? And that either there are two sexes, which applies to our biology, and that there are two genders. And we know that that model isn't incorrect, it's just incomplete. It doesn't really include everyone. So, on the biological dimension of gender, we have things called intersex conditions, and that kind of is an example in biology of how sex is on a spectrum. It's not just male or female, but there are all sorts of folks that have biological makeups that fall somewhere in between. So that would be an example of kind of non-binary biology, so to speak. And gender identity is very similar in that sense. In our society and in our culture, in Western culture, traditionally we have this idea of man and woman. And what we're really finding is that that model is also not including everyone. It's not complete. And there are lots of different identities between man and woman and within this three-dimensional model that have been around for all of history, but we're seeing them surface in our culture in a new way. And so some of the terms people are using to describe themselves when they don't really fall in this traditional binary of male, female, or man, woman are terms like non-binary, genderqueer, pangender, agender, bigender, demigirl, demiboy, and gender neutral. And there are many non-binary people actually that don't like labels at all and just really want to be talked about as themselves. And so I think that it's really important also to note that non-binary genders, or like gender for anyone, is very personal. So when I say all these different terms, what they might mean to me is very different from what they might mean to you or your child or your relative. So it's always important that when you're talking about gender identity to ask about how the person identifies and what that term might mean to them, because as we're seeing the shift in our society, we're really seeing people be able to define for themselves how they feel on the inside. And I think that's really at the root of some of these non-binary identities.
Yeah, and I want to add to that point too, Mare, that this concept or idea or notion that there are more than just two genders, it's actually not a brand new concept. If we kind of look to our world history, we're talking about cultures, civilizations that are centuries old, much older than even the United States, right? And we can look to North America, where the US is today, and that's Two-Spirit Native American cultures, right? Or we can look to our neighbors in the Pacific Island, in Polynesian cultures. We have the Whakaleti in Tonga, we have the Fa'afafine in Samoa, we have even Mahu identities in Hawaii. We can look to other parts of the world in India and look at the Hijra people. And again, so it's not an old concept, it's not an old idea, or it is an older concept and an older idea, but it sees itself being applied still today as well, because New Zealand most recently is one of the first countries in the world now that have actually recognized a third gender category for all their forms, documentation, and that category is gender diverse. Nepal is another country, another example, but they just have the umbrella term of other for someone who doesn't identify as male or female. So kind of just keeping an open mind and open heart when we're thinking and having this conversation as well, because it doesn't have to be so it doesn't have to feel so constricting as we're talking about gender, and I just want that to be a reminder for everyone.
Great.
Great. And I think, Adam, just thinking about all the examples in different cultures and the different terms that are used all over the world and even within Western culture, I think it's important to know that language is a really crucial part of thinking about and learning about non-binary identities, because in our society we don't necessarily have clear-cut language to describe non-binary identities. Some folks who identify as non-binary may consider themselves trans as well. They might consider themselves within that trans asterisk umbrella. But it's important to also recognize that not all non-binary folks identify with the label trans or identify as transgender. Non-binary unto itself is its own gender identity that can be some combination or a rejection of either gender that we typically see in our society. So it's terminology and language around non-binary identities can be really challenging and nuanced. But I think it's important to kind of know that non-binary folks, like anyone else, kind of fall along the spectrum in a lot of different ways, and some identify more as trans and others identify in various other ways.
That's a good clarification. Thanks, Mayor. And then speaking of language, which can be complicated, and especially for families who are new to this, let's talk a little bit about what is a gender-neutral pronoun and why someone's child or relative might want to use them. Mayor, do you want to take that?
Absolutely, yeah. So a gender-neutral pronoun is a pronoun that's used that does not have any kind of association with the traditional binary gender system. So a pronoun that isn't associated with male or isn't associated with female. And a few examples of those pronouns are they, them, theirs, which is actually the pronoun that I prefer. A few other pronouns we're seeing is z, zer, zers, z, here and heres, and z, them, theirs, spelled with xe, xem, and xyrs. I know it can be a little bit confusing, but these are all terms that kind of are ways to respectfully address people without imposing a gender on them. For instance, I can kind of make this a little bit more personal for myself. I grew up in a culture and a family and a society where she had a lot of meaning. She meant girl in a lot of ways. And so when I realized there was more to me than just that part of myself, that pronoun no longer felt like it really fit. And so for me, they, them, theirs is a way of addressing myself or someone else addressing me that validates both male and female parts of myself. So yeah, that's a little bit of an example of why someone would use a gender neutral pronoun. I'll speak from my own experience and a few examples of the pronouns that are out there. But I also want to note that not all non-binary people use gender-neutral pronouns. Pronouns are a really personal choice, and some folks are flexible around pronouns, and some folks are very rigid around the pronouns that they prefer. So again, this is something that's really important to have a dialogue about with your young person, with the person in your life, because they might want you to use gender pronouns in one situation, but not in another. It can be a really kind of interesting and integral part of the process of learning and exploring one's gender. So I just really encourage parents and families out there to think about pronouns and just try and talk about them with the people that are close to them.
Thanks, Mayor. And then Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of why is it important to use a person's correct pronouns?
Yeah, and Mare touched on this just a little bit, but it really does boil down to respect for that person, respect for that person's identity, right? And it's acknowledgement, it's affirming, it goes back to a person's self-esteem, it goes back to you actually acknowledging who that person says and who this person knows they are, right? And even to Mare's earlier point about language as well, I mean, some cultures do have language that allow for a gender-neutral pronoun. Growing up in a Cantonese-speaking household, we actually did have a neutral term. And so if we referred to a person over there, or say give this to that person, the word we would just say is hoi. and it was neutral, and that's how we grew up. But then, I was born in the U.S., born in San Francisco, and raised here, and it was interesting to kind of see what was happening at home being kind of played out and contrasted with what was happening outside of home in school and everyday society, right? And so, kind of, again, having someone acknowledge who you are in a way that you know yourself to be can be really just, again, rewarding to know that people recognize and see you for who you are.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think having your parent or primary caregiver actually see who you are and acknowledge who you are is more important to a child than anything. I mean, it really, there's something very fundamental about a parent or primary caregiver seeing and acknowledging who a child is. So just keep that in mind as well. Let's talk a little bit, how does it feel, I'd like you both to answer really, how does it feel when someone misgenders you and uses the wrong pronouns? Mary, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So I think, that idea of someone misgendering me and how I experience that can be really, really complex. I think that in some respects it can be really, really painful when someone misgenders me. For instance, I can think of this past weekend. I was out with some friends and I went to go use the bathroom, and typically as a non-binary person, when I'm using the restroom and given how I present, I typically assess just whether or not the male or female restroom will be kind of the safer place for me. And I decided at that point in time that the female restroom was going to be the restroom that I used. And so as I opened the door, there was a line, and someone pushed me out of the way and said, "You're in the wrong restroom." And I kind of looked at them and I said, "No, I'm in the right restroom. I use female restrooms actually." And then they began to question me about my gender. And at that point in time, I felt really, just why do I need to defend this part of my identity in order to just use the bathroom? So, in that specific example, it felt really painful, and that there wasn't a place for me to just use the bathroom. But then in other circumstances, when I'm out in the world and I get referred to as sir or he, that type of misgendering for me can feel validating, because a lot of people read me as being someone who was designated female at birth or assigned a girl when I was younger. And so when I'm misgendered as he sometimes, or as a masculine presenting person, it sometimes feels like it validates a part of myself that not everyone sees. So I think that that's just two examples of how misgendering can be complex for non-binary people, right? It's we live in a culture where oftentimes you're seen as one or the other, and it's really challenging to find places where you can be seen as fully yourself. And so that's where I think family support and loved ones really come into play, because we don't live in a world where non-binary identities are really validated all that much, which makes it even more important for parents and caregivers and families to start to see their young people as they feel on the inside, so they don't feel misgendered, or they feel misgendered in ways that validate parts of themselves that they don't often get validated.
Great. And Adam, do you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, I think if I'm looking back at my personal experiences, misgendering happened when I was a child. It was children who were misgendering me as a child, and when children were doing it, they were doing it in a way to tease, to taunt, to harass, right? On in elementary school, on the school playground, and in that kind of instance, it didn't feel good, right? Misgendering then didn't feel good. As an adult, though, when children misgender me, it's interesting. I mean, it of course it doesn't. I shouldn't say of course, but it doesn't hurt me anymore. When I see a little 5-year-old asking their parents, is that a boy or is that a girl? I almost smile at the child, and I hope that when parents are confronted with questions like that by their children, that they do use it as a teaching opportunity, right? That that they don't just automatically assume if they see me that, oh, I don't know, or that's a boy or that's a girl, that they try to use that as a moment to teach their child that, maybe it doesn't matter, and maybe we could go ask this person if they were a friend at a party, or if they were, someone that we were going to get to know, right? That, again, really you being able to assess whether I identify as he or she or non-binary or something else altogether. As strangers, what does it matter to you? But if I'm going to become your family friend, or if I'm going to become, I don't know, your tutor or your teacher at school, then maybe it does matter and it comes into play. But how to address and approach that is a whole other conversation, right? Today, when adults misgender me, I think it's just awkward. It's awkward for everyone. It's awkward for the person misgendering. It's awkward for me. And again, it goes back to the point of what benefit does it have for you to know what my gender is? And because we don't have a relationship. You're just a stranger. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think talking about kind of using wrong pronouns or misgendering, I wanted to bring that up as far as how it feels to receive that, but I also we don't mean to bring it up as far as like making you feel worried about making mistakes. I think there's a very big difference between trying and not trying. And I think for parents and families especially, making an effort and showing your child that you see them and you're trying, and then, apologizing if you make a mistake, or even talking about your kid, okay, I have an old brain, what's going to happen when I make a mistake, how do you want me to deal with it, and just let them know that it's a mistake, it's not, an effort, it's not a reflection of not seeing who they are, and that's really different than not trying at all. Okay, so let's go on. I wanted to you guys have started talking about your personal experiences a little bit, but I wanted to go back and hear about when you were little. What were there times that you tried to show your authentic self, and if so, how was that received? I guess specifically by family, but really in general as well. And then what would have been, if it wasn't your ideal response to it, what would have been a helpful response? Who wants to go first? Mary, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can speak to that first. So when I was little, as far back as I can remember, I had more masculine or boy preferences. I really always gravitated towards the boys' toy section, which was well and thriving when I was growing up, and the boys' clothes section. And my parents were fairly validating of that choice. I think, they were okay with me being a tom girl, so to speak. But it was when, we were going to special occasions, or there was like a big milestone event, and, I had to wear a dress, or I had to conform in a certain way, that really sent me a message that I was allowed to be a certain way within my family, but when I was in this larger world, I was expected to be a different way. And I think that was a big message that I got growing up. Like, I had a lot of support and a lot of family acceptance, but when it came to the broader world around me, all I saw was folks conforming to kind of the gender that they were assigned at birth. I really saw just two types of people. And I didn't know that there were choice beyond those two options. And so for me, it was really wonderful to kind of have those expressions be supported by my family when I was growing up. But I think as I got a little bit older, it would have been nice to hear that those aren't just necessarily expressions, and it's important to kind of continue to think about how you feel about yourself in the inside. That there are options for feeling on the inside more than just what you see as male or female or girl and boy. And so I think for me, though I got some support and validation from my parents around, expressing myself as masculine, it would have been nice to kind of have some exposure to that next level of conversation. Like, what can this mean for adolescence or like adult life? yeah, that would have been really helpful, I think, for me as a child to hear.
And Adam, what about you?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at children, it actually doesn't take a child that much effort to try to be their authentic self, right? Children just want to play, children just want to have fun. Um, and I was no exception, and so I was just being Adam when I was little. But I do remember kind of one of my earliest memories of with the football was actually with an uncle who one day decided to take me, my two cousins, into the garage, and I think it was under the umbrella of, or under this guise of playing catch, but I just remember the football being thrown so hard at me that it would hit me and knock the wind out of me. And then I realized in that moment, like I was really scared of the football, and this was a masculinity exercise, right? Um, you know, I didn't know the term masculinity then, but I knew that someone was trying to show me how to toughen up. Um, and so maybe that's why I'm not so good with sports today. Um, then kind of older child now, maybe 10 years old. I do remember one time my dad taking, again, back into the garage. I don't know what it is with garages. But there was, if you could imagine a concrete floor in a straight line, my dad trying to teach me how to walk a certain way, how to almost walk like a man, right? And again, these adults in my life who weren't saying directly to me, hey, Adam, be a man, toughen up, yet at the same time, looking back and recalling now, they were definitely attempts and efforts to try to um, curve something about me or curve something inside me. And so that wasn't too helpful because it, I think, brought me up feeling a little bit self-conscious about who I was and about particularly my mannerisms, how I express myself, and it all boiled down to my gender expression.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Do you guys have stories about kind of a time when someone maybe reacted in a way that felt validating to you when you were younger, or actually made you feel good? Adam, you want to start?
Yeah, this was actually maybe more recent time as an adult actually, and it meant a lot that it came from my grandmother, and this is my paternal grandmother, who, as I'm coming into, or as I've come into my adulthood, my grandmother would often comment on my beauty, but it would be in a way where she's using, um, again, a Chinese term that you would often use for a female person. And so she would say, oh, Adam, like, come at whole lang, and lang is kind of like pretty, but pretty in a feminine way. And when she would say it with a smile, and I would smile back. And and I think the very first time she said that, I was like, oh, why are you saying that? Again, I was being self-conscious about that, right? Like, oh my gosh, is she challenging my gender again? Yet, I could tell from her smile and the way she said it that she really meant it as like Adam's my grandchild. Um, I felt so accepted and embraced when she said that, and so yeah.
That's nice. And Mare, what about you? Do you have any examples of things that felt good?
Yeah, I mean, I can remember a few things that felt good. I mean, particularly growing up, I grew up in a large family, and I had lots of cousins, and I had a few cousins that were my age, and you know, I think little things growing up I remember to be really validating. Like even when I was playing with all of my cousins, and there would be something that came up where like the girls were gonna do something and the boys were gonna do something else, and you know, hopefully we're not going to split people up like that to begin with. But when my family and when I was accepted by one of the boys, and when I could go with the boys when I wanted to because that's where I felt that I landed, that's something that felt super validating to me, just to like be with my boy cousins who treated me just like one of the boys. I mean, that just being in that kind of environment like really felt validating as when I was a young person. And then also I think, you know, gift giving or even just going out and doing things with your family, when folks really paid attention to what my preferences were, like what I liked and what I didn't like, versus like, oh, what do you like get your niece or what do you get your granddaughter? To me, that was like, this person sees me. This person sees me for who I am, not like this label that's put on me. So whether it was a birthday or whether it was just like an outing with an aunt or uncle to do something like athletic, which I loved growing up, I mean, for me, those were ways that family members were able to be validating when I was younger. And I think now, as I've gotten older, the thing that's felt the most validating when I like come out to folks as non-binary or I share my pronouns, I think two main things come to mind. I think the desire to learn more about gender is really something that's validating. Like when you talk about your own gender and that's received by someone else who wants to learn more about gender and think about their own gender in a different and more complex way, to me that feels incredibly validating. And I think also another thing that feels really validating is when folks take it upon themselves to kind of pull me aside, maybe they haven't seen me a while, and just check in about like what pronouns and what gender identity I'm using. You know, I think it can be challenging to address those questions in a really big public setting. So I always feel super validated and I appreciate it when folks just kind of like pull me aside and say like, hey, I just wanted to check in and see what pronouns you're using right now so I can be respectful. An example of how you can be like supportive and validating in kind of a really easy way.
Definitely. And then what do you both think about if your family had either exposed you to the fact that there were more than two genders when you were little, how would that have affected you? Or if you had been like given total space to just be your authentic self without the labels, how do you think that might have affected your identity today? Adam, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it would have taken a lot of that, again, anxiety, self-consciousness away. That I would have felt maybe more liberty and freedom to just be who I was and not worry about always pleasing others and making sure that I wasn't doing anything or acting in a way just by walking or just by talking that would offend someone, right? Um, and and so I think that maybe my self-esteem is fine, but I think that would have helped a little bit with those feelings and the stress and tension growing up. Um, but also this philosophy that, you know, you're a person and you're a person who can do it all, and you're not going to be limited and restricted by gender roles or gender norms. That as a person, you can do everything she does, you can do everything he does, you can do everything they do. What I think what an uplifting message that as parents we can give our children, right? That the world is this endless place of opportunity.
Great. And Mare, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Adam said. I think that it would have been, for me, really helpful also to know that there were folks out there that might have felt similar feelings to how I felt when I was younger. I think that, you know, especially around puberty, I always just had this feeling that like something was different, something was off, and I didn't really have the language or the knowledge to truly investigate that in terms of my gender identity. You know, I really didn't start doing that till I was a little bit older. And so I think had I kind of known about non-binary identities and different pathways to adulthood and pathways to families when I was younger, I think that would have made puberty a lot easier for me, because for me, puberty was a point in time that really impacted my gender expression and my identity. When my body started to change, you know, that really made me feel like I was put in a position where I had to choose and I had to conform to one to my designated sex at birth. And so I think if I had been given examples of folks who didn't necessarily choose when their body changed, that they were still be able to be themselves fully, that would have made those kind of pre-adolescent and early adolescent years a lot easier to navigate, and much more about exploring myself as opposed to finding a way to fit in when I was living in a culture that really didn't have a space for non-binary people.
Yeah. And so I want to leave some time for questions and answers from participants, but so quickly, can you guys just address a little bit some of the challenges and the benefits that you see about being a non-binary person in this binary gendered world that we live in?
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on two challenges just really quickly because I'd rather talk about the benefits because there are a lot of those. I mean, bathrooms, like I always mentioned, are challenging. And I think really that can depend on how you express yourself in terms of your experience in bathrooms. But I think for non-binary folks, a lot of folks feel like they're presented with two options that just don't really fit them. And when someone doesn't match the sign outside of the door, when you walk into a restaurant and you don't look like the person that's posted outside the door, that raises red flags for folks. And that can be kind of scary as a non-binary person. I mean, you don't really want attention drawn to yourself, or at least I don't when I'm in the restroom. I just want to go to the restroom and, relieve myself and go back to what I was doing. So that's one situation where it can be a little bit challenging. And, I always prefer to use, gender neutral, single stall restrooms. And I try and go to places that have those so I feel comfortable. And then another challenge that I face is really whenever I encounter forms, whether that be like at the doctor's office or when enrolling in classes for school, and I know that I'm going to encounter a system that's truly rooted in this male, female, man, woman binary, and I have to think about ways to assert my gender, or I just have to say, like, maybe I'm in a space where my gender is not going to be asserted. So that can be challenging. And I think for parents especially, it can be helpful for you to try and anticipate those situations for your young person. So you can kind of prepare them that, we're entering a space where, like, they don't know about gender in the way that we talk about it in our family. And so, I'm going to advocate for you and protect you, but just to be open about that and also, anticipate that for your young person, because it can really help them to prepare to navigate a world that still is very binary, though it's becoming more and more non-binary.
And quickly to respond to that as well, that media remains a huge challenge. Media holds so much influence and power over kind of everyday societal perception and understanding of different issues and topics. And certainly gender. We're seeing gender kind of played out in media a lot more in the past couple of years than we've ever have before. And that's great, but we still need to make sure that media is taking the right steps to kind of challenge ignorance, to challenge mistreatment, that it's not fueling it. And what we see not just in media like the news, but what we see out even in social media or in commercials, things that could continue to reinforce this gender binary that you have to be one or the other. Whereas I'm hoping we can see kind of more media outlets taking a stance of, even if you are that professional news reporter, that you could address someone who's non-binary using they, them, their pronouns. That we haven't seen too much yet, right? There's, I think, one or two examples, but gosh, if mainstream media took that on, what a cultural shift we would see. And then just kind of a plug for even providers who are providing services, or parents who are working with providers who are therapists or doctors or social workers who are assisting their young person, that if the professional service provider isn't aware of the diversity of gender, that it can just create that further anxiety and create this negative space where that young person isn't going to want to open up. And while you might bring your young person to the actual office, to the actual setting, they're just not going to seek the services that they so need or so desire, right? And so being kind of conscious of that as well, that that can be a challenge. But again, a benefit or a pro to being non-binary, I just think it's so character building, confidence building. It really does give you this outlook of understanding kind of the both sides, and you kind of go about living life knowing and thinking that you can overcome this. People can accept you for who you are, and then you can do it all.
Great, thanks, Adam. And Mary, did you want to comment on the benefits?
Yeah, I think, one of the benefits is that for me, I can speak to my experience. Once I kind of freed myself from those two gender boxes that I had grown up with, and that I had been kind of socialized to see, I felt kind of liberated to explore in a way that I never had before. I didn't feel like there was this preset list of expectation and rules that went along with gender. Gender was really about my personal experience, and it was about, connecting and finding myself. And so I think for me, it was really, really freeing to be able to focus on my own personal experience and then start to use language and create definitions that better describe that experience. I mean, what better thing can you have than to create and use a word that has a really, really special and personal meaning to you? I think for me, that's been one of the best benefits of being non-binary, is being seen and understood by people and that are close to me, that I can be open with my gender about in a way that I really didn't envision was possible when I was really young.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I want to go to a couple of questions. I have some questions that came in earlier and some questions that have come in now. Tessa asks, my friend identifies as non-binary, and their parents keep telling them, I just wish you would decide which one you are. How can they and others respond to that? And that is something that I hear, in supporting parents too. It's like, oh, it would be so much easier if they just chose one or the other, So I just wanted to hear, how do you respond to that sentiment? Who wants to take that? Mary, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that one. So I think that, that's a challenging question, because I think that, right now in our society, there's this kind of spotlight on transgender and a certain experience of transgender, right? We have examples in pop culture of folks like Caitlyn Jenner, who in some ways presented their story as transitioning from one gender to the other. And when you do that, you're utilizing kind of the systems that we're socialized to know. You're utilizing those binary pronouns of he and she, and you're going from one known label to another known label. So I think that's where this desire for folks to decide comes from, is because when you're asked to use language and think about things in a new way, you're not only asked to take in new information, but you're asked to unlearn old information, which can take a lot of time. And it can be really frustrating because you make mistakes. And so I think it's important, when you get that question, to kind of be able to let folks know about the challenges that you're experiencing because you're new to this language and the concept, but it's also really important to try. It's so important to try, because for some non-binary people, and I can talk about myself personally, I don't think I'm ever gonna decide about my gender identity. I think it's always going to be something I'm exploring, and it's always something I'm going to be checking in with myself about. So really kind of having a dialogue about how gender identity isn't, for some people, something that stays stagnant. For me personally, it's shifted over time. And so I think really being open about that. But that kind of notion of wanting someone to decide really comes from wanting an answer, wanting a right way to address them respectfully. And again, this comes back to language. Unfortunately, in our society, we don't have the language to do that easily. So it becomes a really challenging process for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I guess I would just like to emphasize that fact that it's like that kids or people who are non-binary are not necessarily traveling on a journey. They're not in the middle of a journey. They, they may very well be at their destination. Like this is their identity. They're not like on one step towards being transgender. And I think that's something that a lot of people get confused about and are kind of waiting for their kids to decide. But this is the decision for many, many kids. So it's not a decision, but this is who they are. This is this is their identity. It's not transforming. It's not one step. And I forgot my other question. All right, I'll come back to that. So then there's one other question from Bradley Gwynn, and it says, will my child want to change their body if they identify as non-binary? Adam, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. The answer is maybe, maybe not. When it comes to non-binary people and gender expression, it's so varied, it's so different for each individual, and so it really is going to go back to your specific person. But to again speak about what does it mean to change your body, I mean, for some people it can mean a new hairstyle, right? It can just be it could be taking on a different outwardly appearance, even with clothing and whatnot. But in terms of changing the physical body, it's such an individual decision, and individual that perhaps this non-binary person does need to, reduce the chest or increase chest size so that they feel that they can represent themselves more authentically to the world. Then it becomes the individual decision. I don't know what more to add to it than that. Yeah.
No, I think that's good. Mayor, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that the only one thing I would add is, something that I've heard in my experience of being non-binary and thinking about that very question, changing bodies or not, is, I thought changing bodies was only something transgender people did. I didn't think that non-binary people, needed surgery or needed hormones or any of the other medical interventions that we sometimes associate with, aligning your gender identity and expression in biology. And so I think that it's important to also just know that if a non-binary person does want to explore changing their body, it's important to validate that and support that, just like you would any other trans or cisgender person that might actually feel like they need to align their body to better match how they feel on the inside. So I also just want to throw that out there, is because that's kind of a narrative that I've heard in my experience, and I think it's important for parents and families and cis allies out there to know that, like Adam said, all of it's a possibility, right? There's no easy answer.
Right. I mean, just as gender identity is really personal, how you feel about your body and aligning your body to your gender identity is completely personal too. Some people do nothing. Some people will do a little bit. Some people will do a lot, as far as medical intervention. So it's completely personal, and it's all about just aligning your physical self to how you feel on the inside. Okay, we're running out of time a little bit, so I wanted to kind of go over some tips for parents about just ways that you can help your kids, no matter how they identify right now. So one thing I wanted to bring up is, and I think we talked about this a little bit, how there's no models in the world for anything besides, in our society right now, really, except for male and female. And I think that puts the responsibility on us as parents and caregivers to bring that other options into the picture. So even when our kids are little, talking about, sometimes people, feel like they're boys, sometimes they feel like they're girls, and sometimes people feel like they're both or neither, or there's lots of other types of genders. Everybody's gender is different. Like, it can be very simple, but just anytime we're talking about, boys and girls, like, to actually add into the conversation that there are other options as well. That can, just that simple statement can really open up a whole new world for a child that they're not going to automatically see out in the world. Oops, sorry, I'm muted. Mayor, Adam, do you have other tips that you would want to bring up for parents?
Yeah, I think bringing up examples in your own experience of like when you were told you should or shouldn't do something because of your gender, you should or shouldn't like something because of your gender. I think kind of modeling the conversation around gender and how it shows up in our world really can just let young people know that this is a safe space and that they're not the only ones thinking about these things. I think a lot of non-binary young people, and I can speak from my own experience, I thought I was the only one thinking about a lot of these things and the only one seeing a lot of these things. I wasn't thinking about the fact that, my mom growing up, in the 70s as a feminist, was told she couldn't wear pants and she couldn't, play certain sports. But that conversation would have been really helpful in just starting the discussion and starting that process of, what is this thing we call gender and how does it show up in our lives and shape who we are? Because I think we all have certain experiences, even though non-binary and genderqueer feel like these new really foreign terms. I think that those terms really embody this experience of crossing traditional gender lines, which we all have a lot of experience with. So that's another tip I would say.
Yeah, and adding on to that, I think, right, like Mary was saying, talking about our experiences with the gender norms and gender messages as parents can be really helpful to our kids. Like anything that you felt like you couldn't do, or the things that you should do, or anything that the ways that you didn't like fit into this very strict gender box, talking about that with your kids and having your kids hear about that can really help them, think about their own gender and ways that they fit into boxes and don't, and really help them kind of define themselves. Adam, what about you? Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, this experience of sharing this conversation space with both you, Pam, and Mare, is very eye-opening even for myself, because on the pathway and journey to becoming a new parent myself, one of the very key lessons I'm always shared with is Adam, throw all your expectations out the window. And really what they mean by that is, all right, you're going to have a child, you're going to have a baby, but this person is just not going to be who you think they're going to be. They're going to be themselves. They're going to be who they are. And I think that's just a key reminder that we have to remind ourselves that we should follow the steps and the paths of our children and not try to force them into something that they're not. It's different of saying, like, I'm going to require that my kid take piano lessons. It's something else altogether when you say, you can't talk this way, you can't walk this way, you can't wear that, you have to wear this. Those kinds of, curving who this child is does show long-term effects of hurting that person mentally, psychologically, emotionally. And I think as parents, something we all want to avoid, right, completely. So I share that.
Yeah, I mean, I think also following our child's path sometimes means learning to live with uncertainty. And I think that's something that's hard for a lot of parents. Kind of, if I just knew they were this, then I would know what to do and I could help them on this path. Or I could, there would be I want to just know ABC, what do I do to help my kid? And sometimes it's not that simple. So kind of learning to live with this space in the middle, learning to live with, the uncertainty of, what our child's gender may be, is something that I think is really helpful on this journey. And then just one other tip I wanted to throw in is to engage in discussions about gender that don't have to do with your kid all the time. I think sometimes parents we want to know how our kid is feeling, we want to know what they're feeling this week and next week, and You know, so we ask them about their gender a lot. And I think a lot of time, for some kids that's fine, and for other kids that can be difficult. So, you know, a tip is just to talk about gender related to other people. You know, say, oh, I read an article, or I saw this on TV, or even if you're making that up, just a way to bring in, you know, oh, I read about a person who such and such, and bring up a, you know, discussion about gender, but that is not about your kid. I think that can be helpful too. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to touch on how do you guys think future generations are going to be approaching gender? You know, things have changed a lot already, but I think they're changing rapidly. And just wanted to hear what your reflections are, kind of what, how this generation when they're grown up and future generations are going to be dealing with non-binary gender identities. Adam, you want to go first?
Yeah, I have the privilege and the honor of working with some amazing young people through Gender Spectrum's National Youth Advisory Council. And you know, we're having these 2-hour-long conversations every couple of weeks, and I'm just constantly surprised in a really good way of their outlook and perception of life and what life is now and what life can and will be in the future moving forward, that there is this shift and we're seeing it happen right before our eyes. And what I'm seeing is just more open hearts and open minds around gender, that we're not going to judge, we're not going to critique, that we accept and appreciate who this person is and what they embody. And that, for me, is a very, very hopeful outlook, a very, very hopeful future. It doesn't mean that it's going to come easily. I am constantly inspired by the passion and the dedication that these young people commit to their work and to their projects. And so, you know, I just want to be there to support 110% my ability to help them get there.
Mary, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that something that I think that we're going to see in future generations is just this ability to identify gender for yourself, right? I think that our world is really moving from a place of conformity to a place of celebrating difference. And I think this difference is really empowering our young people to push back against these labels that were imposed on us when we were young. And these young people are kind of looking at these labels and saying, this doesn't fully encapsulate who I am. And they're not standing for it, right? Young people are saying, like, this isn't enough. And so it's wonderful that our young people have creative minds enough to start creating new terms where they can really identify their personal gender experience themselves. And so I think that we're really kind of moving towards a world where folks want language and want words to be able to really authentically describe themselves, and they're not settling with the labels that have been given to us and passed down through history and things like that. I think we're going to see more terminology come up. I think you know, all of our definitions are going to be different for, you know, what genderqueer might mean to me will be completely different for what genderqueer means for someone else, and that's going to be okay. You know, I don't think in the future, my hope is that no one's gender is going to be simplified to a box. So I think that that's really hopefully where we're going.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to end here. We would love to continue the conversation on the Gender Spectrum Lounge. There's a link here for it, and then also on our website, which is just www.genderspectrum.org. If you're not already a member of the lounge, you can join there. And then there's also, we're going to put we'll put these resources and then also a couple of really helpful videos if you want to watch them as well on the Gender Spectrum Lounge. And it's going to be a forum in the Raising Kids Outside the Gender Boxes group. So that's where you can find it. This video will also be on YouTube if you want to show it to anybody else. And thank you so much for participating. Bye.